It is the latest twist in the upcoming presidential election. President Joe Biden bows out of the race. And now the Democratic Party is looking for new candidates to fill out their side of the ballot. And who will be the vice presidential pick?
Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear is among those being discussed. His name is among nearly a dozen being touted as a potential VP. Those include cabinet secretaries, governors, and senators. While Kentucky isn't considered a key battleground state, others on that list include governors of North Carolina, Maryland, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and California. Beshear appeared on this morning's episode of MSNBC to endorse Vice President Kamala Harris and talk about his own political future. Flattered is how Governor Andy Beshear describes feeling as his name is tossed around for consideration on the Democratic vice presidential ticket.
Well, I think if somebody calls you on that, what you do is at least listen. And I want the American people to know what a Kentuckian is and what they look like, because let me just tell you that J.D. Vance ain't from here.
Beshear says he fully supports Vice President Kamala Harris to lead the country.
As a prosecutor, as an attorney general like I used to be, she prosecuted rapists, domestic abusers, stood for victims, and put away those abusers. Now look at the other side, where J.D. Vance calls pregnancy arising from rape inconvenient.
However, some point out Beshear hasn't had to take a stance on a lot of controversial national discussions, like the conflict between Israel and Palestine.
Because the goalposts of the Kentucky abortion debate are on the right, because we have this near total abortion ban, he's able to just say, I don't support this near total abortion ban, instead of having to constantly litigate where exactly he is on that specific issue.
And the Bluegrass isn't even a swing state, so it may not be as appealing to the party.
When you think about Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Roy Cooper in North Carolina, these are states that really could go either way and have trended, at least in the most recent polls, a little Republican, and are states that Democrats need to get over the finish line. Kentucky is not a state Democrats need.
But Lieutenant Governor Jacqueline Coleman said this morning she will be prepared to fill his role if necessary.
The reason that they pick a lieutenant governor is to have that succession plan in place, and they pick someone they believe is ready. And I wouldn't have accepted if I didn't think I was ready, and I don't think the governor would have asked me if he didn't think I was ready. So I'm ready.
Many of you shared your opinion in our web poll about Joe Biden's decision to exit the presidential race. The vast majority of you agree with him ending his re-election campaign. To cast your vote, just scan the QR code you see there on the bottom side of your screen, or look for the poll on our homepage and inside the WKYT News app.